because we've got a long passage to look at, chapters 1 and chapter 2, I'm going to look at it in two sections. So Ollie has just read chapter 1, and we're going to, in the next 15 minutes or so, look at chapter 1 under three different headings: population explosion, oppression, and attempted genocide. And after we've looked at chapter 1, we will then have our second song, and we shall also have the second reading. Ollie will read chapter 2 to us, and then I'll come up again and look at chapter 2, looking again at three sections about Moses, and then finally a last point about God's response to the situation. So that is how we're going to go this evening. So then let's start looking at chapter 1 and verses 1 to 7, population explosion. And the first point I want to make there is the missing and. In our NIV, you won't find this word, but in the original languages, the book of Exodus begins with the word and. And that emphasizes and points out to us, doesn't it, that Exodus is not just a standalone book. It's not just book number 2 out of 66, but it very much is linked with the previous book, the book of Genesis. Exodus is very much the continuation of the book of Genesis. And indeed, verse 1 of Exodus, these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. And then the list of the names is a verbatim repeat of a verse in Genesis chapter 46, verse 8, which describes those sons of Israel going down into Egypt. And what happened over the years that they were there in Egypt, indeed over the generations that they were there in Egypt? Well, we see this group of 70 developing from an extended family to a potential nation. And this was very much in fulfillment of what God had said to Jacob before they ever went down into Egypt. God encouraged and assured Jacob, who was very fearful of leaving the land that God had given them and going down into Egypt. But God said to him, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there." That was the promise that God had made. And that is indeed what would happen over the next 4 centuries or so. Interestingly, in verse 1, we have that phrase, the sons of Israel. Remember, Israel was the name that Jacob was later given. And that is actually the last time in the Old Testament that that phrase, the sons of Israel, would be used to describe Jacob's immediate family. From then on, that phrase would refer to the whole people of God. So how did this happen? How was it this group of 70 developed into a huge nation or a potential nation? And we're told that when they left Egypt, there were 600,000 fighting men amongst them, amongst others. Well, I wonder if you notice the Genesis language in verses 6 and 7. In verse 6 and 7, we're told that in Goshen, that is the area of Egypt where the Israelites had settled and lived, they fulfilled the mandate of Genesis 1 and verse 28. There are 3 phrases that come straight from Genesis 1 and verse 28. They were fruitful. They became exceedingly numerous, and they filled the land. By the way, filling the land probably wasn't the whole of Egypt, but filling that region, filling the land of Goshen. So things seemed to be going very well for them. They were growing, they were fulfilling the mandate, but that very fruitfulness led to a huge problem for them and led eventually to oppression, as we see in the second section there. Verses 8 to 14 are a picture of oppression. Let's see, first of all, the reasoning behind the oppression. Well, we're told that a new king came into power, a new pharaoh in Egypt, one to whom Joseph meant nothing, or a new king who did not know about Joseph. In the early years, after Joseph had gone down to Egypt, the Israelites were treated very, very well because of the high respect that the people had for Joseph. You remember that he had actually saved Egypt from famine, as he had given the Pharaoh the interpretation of his dream and then put things into action to rescue the nation from the lean years by setting food aside during the rich years. But now there was a new king, not the next one. He was probably several kings onwards. But now came a Pharaoh who didn't know about Joseph, who had forgotten all about it. We see there, don't we, the value of history. And what did this new Pharaoh say about the Israelites? He said, the Israelites have become too numerous. It's interesting, actually, people throughout the generations have always been wary of immigrants. And very often, if you were to ask people about the number of immigrants in a particular country or a particular city, the estimates that people give of how many there are nearly always far too high. It's the high figure of prejudice. Did Pharaoh really feel this? Was this a genuine fear he had? He said they've grown numerous. If we were to be attacked by other Semite nations, they would join with them and attack us. Did he have any grounds for thinking this? Or was this a very handy excuse for him to have free labor to build his store cities? By the way, the names of those store cities that are given to us that have been discovered archaeologically since then prove the historicity of these events. We're not talking about myth here. These are historical events with real people, real cities, and so on. So that was the reasoning that the Pharaoh gave to oppress the people of Israel. So what were the actions that he took? Well, first of all, he set over them slave masters to oppress them. That word oppress means to bring low or to beat down. That was the aim of it. So that was in verse 11, but in verse 12 we're told, but still they multiplied. So that didn't do the job. Then we read that he worked them ruthlessly. That word ruthlessly appears twice in verses 13 and 14. In fact, there are only 5 uses of that word in the whole of the Old Testament. It's a word that signifies to display violence. So they were really being mistreated, being worked ruthlessly with perhaps an element of violence. And then we're told that the slave masters were told to make their lives bitter. I'm sure you will remember, and we'll come across this in future weeks, when it comes to the Passover and the Passover meal. One of the parts of the Passover meal were bitter herbs, and those bitter herbs were part of the meal to remind them of the bitter lives that they'd had under slavery to the Egyptians. But this oppression was still not sufficient to stop the Israelites multiplying and growing. And so the Pharaoh took the next step and attempted genocide. This Pharaoh was relentless in his frustrations. First of all, of course, he told the Hebrew midwives, 2 of them are named, they were perhaps the lead ones, but surely there were many, many more of them. He told them, first of all, to kill any boys who were born. And when that didn't work, when they seemed to find an ingenious answer as to why they didn't kill them, then it was spread to the whole population. In verse 22, Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. I think it's unfortunate the NIV has actually translated as boys and girls the words that are actually sons and daughters. That makes a difference, doesn't it? Boys and girls as general, sons and daughters remind us that these are children of mothers and fathers. Alec Matthias said of this, by those words we get a glimpse of the personal anguish that this caused. In this passage also we see God's grace to these faithful midwives who just would not carry out the horrendous genocide that Pharaoh was demanding. And as we said, they found excuses to give, reasons to give perhaps to Pharaoh as to why they wouldn't carry this out or couldn't carry this out. And God blesses them with families for their faithfulness. Alan Cole said about this, their reverence for life sprang from their reverence to God, the life giver. And for this, they were rewarded with families. And he goes on to say, the relevance of this to the abortion controversy should be carefully pondered. Well, as we think of this attempted genocide, this killing of the boys in order to destroy a potential enemy, surely we are reminded of the connection with the one who is greater than Moses. In the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 3 is taken up by describing how Jesus is greater than Moses. But just as there was an attempt to prevent the birth of Moses, who would be the deliverer by Pharaoh, so there would be a failed attempt to kill Jesus, the greater deliverer, by King Herod through that appalling massacre of the innocents. Well, in a moment or two, we're going to sing again a hymn which are the lines, days of darkness still come o'er me, sorrow's path I often tread. Well, that was certainly the case for the Israelites. Imagine being one of those generations after Joseph, but before the Exodus, going through this horrendous slavery and this threat to their children. And surely they must have cried out at times, why, Lord? How long, Lord? And sometimes we ask that question as well, don't we? And I hope when we come back to part 2, we'll perhaps give at least some indications as to what God will say about that. But let's sing that song now. I will sing the wondrous story, and then Ollie will read chapter 2, and I'll come back to consider that chapter. Well, then we've seen something of the dire situation into which Moses was born. And in chapter 2 that Ollie has just read for us, we see the first 80 years of Moses' life. And we see from birth that ultimately Moses was saved by God. We'll sing at the end, who alone can rescue? And it is indeed God alone who could rescue Moses, as it is God alone who can rescue us. Humanly speaking, Moses was born into an absolutely perilous situation, wasn't he? Here was he, a Hebrew boy, and the order had gone out that all Hebrew boys would be killed by being drowned in the Nile. And when he had got to 3 months old, he couldn't be hidden any longer, and something had to be done. As I say, it was a perilous situation with regard to humanity, but for God, it was not an issue or a problem. The name Moses is actually quite interesting because it has both Egyptian and Hebrew connections. A lot of Egyptian pharaohs actually had a name which ended in Moses. So you had Thuthmose and Ahmose. It was a suffix meaning is born. But also the word in Hebrew has the meaning of pulled out or drawn out, because of course Moses was pulled out, drawn out of the water. So right from his birth, he was delivered through water. And Youngblood and Kaiser point out that the account of Moses' remarkable deliverance in infancy foreshadows the deliverance from Egypt that God would later effect through him. He was saved out of the water. He would deliver the people of Israel through the waters, through the sea. But if Moses was ultimately saved by God, God, of course, used means to save him. And it's fascinating to see the means that God used. He was pursued, of course, by a mighty power. Pharaoh was wanting to kill him along with all of the other Hebrew boys. The whole population of Egypt had been given permission to kill any Hebrew infant that they came across. And how were they to kill them? By drowning them in the Nile, the river god of Egypt. So all these forces were against Moses, but he was rescued by weak women. And that weak, by the way, should be in inverted commas. Weak in the sense that they had no status in Egypt. They had no apparent power, and yet these women were far from being weak. They had many huge, tremendous attributes which God used. There were the midwives that we've already touched upon, these faithful midwives who risked certainly their own lives by refusing to carry out Pharaoh's command to kill all the baby boys. And then there was his mother who hid him for 3 months. And then when he got to that stage, she hides him and she puts him in that vessel on the river. Apparently, it wasn't unheard of for this to happen at the time. In fact, one commentator commented that it's a little bit like today, somebody putting their baby on the steps of an orphanage with the expectation that they would be found. And then there's resourceful Miriam, his sister, who looks out to see who would pick him out of the water. And she sees this Egyptian princess. And look at that resourcefulness. The Egyptians actually pay the mother to look after her own child. Brilliant. And finally, we have tender-hearted Pharaoh's daughter, who will not leave the child there, but takes him to look after him. And as I say, gives him back to his mother to look after him. But as we see, the apparently weak and powerless overcoming the plans of the mighty. Aren't we reminded of that verse in Corinthians which says, God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And when we feel our weakness, and we know our weakness, both as a church and as individuals, we have no great status and standing in this country, in this world. Yet, take heart. God is able to use even people like us to bring about his plans. And then we move on 40 years and we find Moses having to take sides. Moses is, as I say, now 40 years old, as Stephen points out, if you look at Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, and we're told that he was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. In fact, when he goes to Midian, which we'll see soon, the people there take him for an Egyptian. He probably looked like an Egyptian. But he was almost certainly also aware of his Hebrew origins from his mother nursemaid, amongst others. And we hear then in verse 11, don't we, that he saw this Egyptian mistreating and killing a Hebrew. We're told that he looked on their burdens, he watched them at their hard labor. And that isn't just a little glance. The word is looked with distress and with deep emotion. And as he looks on the situation of his fellow Hebrews and he sees this Egyptian mistreating him, he kills that Egyptian. And a little bit later, he realizes, he finds out that that has become known. And he realizes he will have to leave Egypt. He will have to flee. His act was certainly foolish. I'm reminded of the petulant Peter when I think of Moses at this time. And humanly speaking, it put back the deliverance of the people for 40 years. The action was wrong, but the impulse was right. As somebody has said, Moses was one who shared God's heart, as God too was angry at the injustice that his people were facing. But his action was in the end a decisive choice. The writer to the Hebrews puts it like this: he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. When I was a teenager, I remember a song that was around at the time. I think I heard it by Pete Seeger, and I thought that was the original. But when I looked it up, I found it was actually a 1930s union song, a Labour union song, which is called "Which Side Are You On?" More recently, Billy Bragg has covered it, and that asks this very stark question, In the matter of this dispute, you can't sit on the fence. Which side are you on? Moses, when he saw that Egyptian mistreat the Hebrew, had to decide which side was he on. And it's a question, isn't it, that the Bible often asks of us. In the end, ultimately, which side, whose side are you on? Well, and Moses flees to Midian, beyond Egypt, into the wilderness. And the first action we see him taking part in is he rescues the 7 daughters of Reuel. By the way, he's later called Jethro. It's the same person. He supports, once again, he supports the underdog. In this case, as I say, these 7 daughters in an argument over well and water rights with some shepherds. And one of the things we see, by the way, in Moses is that he does have an admirable sense of justice. They were being treated unkindly, wrongly, and he rescued them and fed the sheep, the flock, himself. And what is the result of this? Well, his kind act leads to accommodation and employment with Reuel Jethro. It leads to marriage to his daughter Zipporah and the birth of his first son, Gershon. Names are obviously very significant, aren't they, in the Bible? And Gershon actually means a foreigner there. And he gave his first son that name because, as he recognized, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. But although he was a foreigner in a foreign land, God continued to care for him whilst he was there. He was gone, but not forgotten. And then we read towards the end of chapter 2, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. A long period. It would seem that Moses was there in Midian for a further 40 years, in which he seems to have mellowed, accepted his obscurity, but he was being prepared by God for the task ahead. I wonder if we would have such patience. I'm not sure I would have. But we read then that during that long period, or after it, that particular king of Egypt died, paving the way for the possibility of Moses' return. Finally, we come to the last couple of verses. God shows his concern. Notice there, shows his concern. It's not that he hadn't been concerned beforehand, but now he shows it and he reveals it. What was happening back in Egypt during these 40 years? Well, the Israelites were continuing to suffer oppression. And how did they respond? Well, we're told that the people groaned, cried out, cried for help. And that was a right response. And it's a right response for us when we're under oppression, when we're under the cosh. Let's not be ashamed to cry out to God for help. And no doubt they asked that question, why so long? Why so long? Why are we having to go through these painful trials? Now, as we saw with the book of Ezekiel, which we've just finished looking at, some trials are brought on by our own sin. In the first 30-odd chapters, as you know, Ezekiel was constantly telling the people of Israel, you are going to go into exile. Some of you are here already. Jerusalem is going to fall and all the people are going to go into exile. And he laid it on with a trowel. This has happened because of your faithlessness. But these trials were different. The Israelites were not in any way to blame for their enslavement. They had gone down to Egypt because of famine, And God, in fact, had directed them to go down there. And there is no particular hint in the chapters there that the people were faithless to God. So we cannot assume when we have trials, we cannot assume that it is because of our sin. And so they cry out, as perhaps sometimes we do, you know, why so long? Why so long before I get a job? Why so long that I'm in a job that is so difficult for me as a believer? Why so long that perhaps a relative or myself goes through serious illness? Why so long a period of depression? Whatever it might be, all sorts of oppression. And we say, why, Lord, why so long? And the honest answer to that is, in any individual case, we cannot really give the specific answer. But this we must bear in mind. It is not ever that God has forgotten us or that he has ceased to care for us if we are his children. He knows the reason why it is so long, even if at the minute he hasn't told us. And all we can do is go step by step, day by day, calling out to him, but trusting him. Because how did God in the end show his concern? We're told that he heard, that he remembered, that he looked on, that he was concerned. God had always seen them, remembered them, looked on them. But a time came, the hour had come when God would act, and he would fulfill the promise that he made to Jacob. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And do join us again next week and the weeks after as we see how that is fulfilled and brought to fruition. Well, let's sing together once again in closing that song that I mentioned earlier. You alone can rescue. Who, O Lord, could save themselves?